This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO Crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And hello, this is in fact A Different Perspective, and I am Kevin Randle. Before I bring on my guest, I have to rant. I was somewhere the other day and I saw a copy of a magazine published by the History Channel about the paranormal. And of course, it always includes a section on UFOs, and it annoys me that UFOs are in the paranormal realm. I think of paranormal like ghosts and the Bermuda Triangle and ESP and this sort of esoteric stuff, and not really UFOs. I don't think of it as paranormal. What annoyed me, of course, is they mentioned Roswell, and they, of course, bought into the Project Mogul explanation. I am astonished that people still buy this explanation when clearly flight number 4, which was the Mogul balloon flight that supposedly caused the debris, is mentioned at all, since Dr. Albert Crary, who was the project manager, wrote in his field notes that flight number 4 never flew. But what really got me was there was a note on the Aurora, Texas alleged crash. And because the UFO hit a windmill, they published a picture of a windmill with a flying saucer in it, a UFO. A well-known picture, and anybody who studied UFOs for more than 10 minutes or photography for more than 10 minutes realize what the UFO is in fact, a lens flare. I don't know why this thing keeps being published as a UFO picture, but everybody knows what it is. And the second thing they did was they published the picture taken by the Coast Guardman in July of 1952. I think everybody's pretty well established that they're not flying saucers in this picture. And it may well be a hoax, but I looked it up in the Project Blue Book files just the other day because of this magazine article, and realized that the statements by the Coast Guardsman, excuse me, both the photographer and the other witness are very, very weak. And in fact, they're filled with what I think of as weasel words, meaning they don't want to lie about something, but they're trying to maintain the story. And I have published on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com an analysis of this whole thing. So you can read in detail, you can see the pictures, you can see what the Coast Guardsman said. You can see the picture of the UFO near the tower and all of that, the water tower and all of that sort of thing, for those of you who want to follow up on it. But the real point is I am just tired of these magazines dealing with UFOs as part of a larger paranormal work and not doing any kind of basic research. Having now gotten that off my chest, we will move on. I am going to be speaking with Don Schmitt. I don't think he really needs much of an introduction. Everybody knows who he is. He's been on the program many times. And I think a lot of people enjoy our conversations because they're not really adversarial per se, but a discussion of the UFO phenomenon from, different perspectives. Don Schmitt, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Well, hello, my friend. Good to be back with you, Kevin. So, hey, you want to talk about History Channel?
If you have something to add, please do so.
Well, it's amazing that, and as we both experienced with the series that ran last December, that even when they could consult with the so-called experts on the topic, and in this case, it would have been Roswell, that they failed to do so, that they decided to go off and on their own tangents and compile their own information, their own research, and then you watch the program and you're practically jumping out of your chair going, why did they include that? Why did they use that particular witness or non-witness? Why couldn't they even get the rank of that officer correct? when, we both know exactly what the rank is. And it just, again, smacks of just the laziest of journalism. But I don't know that we can accuse the cable networks of even journalism as much as they're in the entertainment business.
Well, I think that's the key. It's entertainment. And I think the reason they go out and look for their own witnesses because they want something new, something different that hasn't been discussed. And even though they find somebody else to talk about it, the information is still the same.
It is still the same. And the fact that they even resurrect the old discredited, old disproven. I mean, as I couldn't agree with you more. How often do we have to explain away flight number 4? Without having a single witness, without being able to put it on that very site, without being able to even demonstrate any record that it was launched. I mean, yes, the balloon train was launched, but there was no array train. There was no nothing else as far as the instrumentation or anything that was part of that. They had filled the balloons with helium. They jettisoned the balloons. That was the extent of it. That hardly would, reflect the type of wreckage that all the witnesses have described. So it's like, why do they always fall back on the government of all authorities on a topic that the government has been running interference on for almost 75 years?
I need to say this because, I've studied the mogul balloon thing in depth. And they always come out, well, it was a top secret Project Mogul. While the purpose was classified, yes, it may have been top secret. What was going on in New Mexico, the balloon launches, was not.
Was not, no.
We have pictures from newspapers of the balloon launches. And was it the Alamogordo News
right.
On July 10th has a picture, and one of the pictures has a step ladder in it as they're trying to launch a balloon. And Charles Moore told me he bought the ladder.
Yes.
So it links it directly to what was going on in New Mexico.
Well, as you recall too, I mean, they were putting on these demonstrations all over the country, as though not only were they trying to explain away Roswell, but all the flying disc reports at that time, that they were all mistakenly, high altitude balloons that, based on the air pressure would tend to become more elliptoid and maybe look like a disc at high altitude. But the difference always comes back with Roswell is when it's on the ground in front of you and you can actually pick it up and hold it in your hands, you might be able to determine that it's a balloon, juxtaposed at 10,000 feet up.
Well, to take that one step further, you and I both talked to Sheridan Cabot a number of times.
Oh, yes.
And we sat in there when he first denied that he'd ever been involved in any balloon recovery whatsoever. He was too busy to do that. But then he comes out and he tells Colonel Weaver, who, by the way, has been on this program, about picking up the balloon debris or recognizing it immediately for what it was. And my thought is, why didn't you mention this to Jesse Marcel right then? Jess, this is a balloon. We don't need to stay here. Let's go home.
And then to take it a step further, well, then at the least he should have done as far as informed Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, before they put out the press release, before they supposedly made, an embarrassment of the very people in charge of the atomic bomb at that time, the 509th bomb wing. So we know, he contradicted himself and he really discredited himself in that supposed sworn affidavit that he gave to Colonel Weaver.
Absolutely. I think we should move on from Roswell, though.
Yes.
Rather than we beat that dead horse. Oh my God! Now the PETA people are going to come after me for that expression.
Oh my God! I know.
I wanted to mention to you up front the government changing UFO now to UAP, from unidentified flying object to unidentified aerial phenomenon.
Right.
What's your reaction to that?
Well, and in some respects, that's almost a takeoff on what the Russians, when they talk about aerial. As far as anomaly or aerial phenomenon and that sort. So it's as though they were playing around with words and trying to, well, how can we come up with a whole new concept, a whole new approach and move forward, from possibly even this next month, from June of 2021. And it's the same old horse, so to speak. I'm more concerned of the fact that nobody seems to be addressing the long established history of the phenomenon, that all the players that are currently involved really know nothing prior to maybe 2004 regarding the subject.
Well, that's an interesting take on it, because we now introduce a new term, UAP, and we kind of divorce it from the long history of the UFO phenomenon. So now it's like something that's brand new, and we will dispose of this new phenomenon now and move on to other arenas and ignore this long history. And when I think it may have been Jimmy Carter, one of the presidents, proposed moving the UFO investigation to NASA,
that was Carter.
They objected to it.
Right.
NASA didn't want any part of it, and
no,
I think
that's right.
I don't think it would have helped their image at all by getting involved in the UFO investigations. But there should have been somebody investigating it, and we know there was.
But when you think about it, I mean, NASA, with their limited budgetary constraints, they're dealing as far as just like after the Challenger and the Columbia disasters, for example. And the fact that it would shut down an entire program for 2 or 3 years at a time, and yet you could have a plane crash with 300 fatalities, and the next plane goes right back up. So NASA's always walking on eggshells in that regard. And for that matter, what interest or what involvement would they have even had with the subject? I think it's one of the reasons that even when the late Congressman Stephen Schiff, through the GAO, the General Accounting Office, when they made that document search, and one of the sources that they did not request or rely on for documentation was NASA, our own space program, because what files would they have compiled regarding a local phenomenon, unless they were concerned that it would impede a potential rocket launch or something at times. And to me, when Carter made that request to NASA, it was because he was denied by all other branches of the military and departments of intelligence, and he just tossed it at NASA, hoping they might bite.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I did a book, as I think everybody knows, called UFOs in the Deep State. Right. And in that I explore the Carter claim that he was going to look into the UFOs, and talking to Dan Sheehan and a couple of people about that, we learned that the way that the deep state or the government can inhibit the president's investigation, they don't have to outright deny it, say, well, I can't tell you that, Mr. President, it's classified above your level. But what they can do is, there's a lot of agencies involved in this, Mr. President. We'll draw all this material together from these agencies, and we'll get you a comprehensive report. And they just never bothered to get the report done. Well, we're in the works on it, or something else comes up that takes precedence. Like in the Carter administration, it would have been the Iran hostage situation. That certainly would have diverted his attention.
And you certainly know better than most as far as the compartmentalization as they use as an excuse. But and we both know as far as just what efforts it takes to just retrieve a single Freedom of Information Act request. I mean, it can literally take years for just a single, document. And the thought that, and I always come back to, and you again know this better than most, that within the compartmentalization of a particular branch of the military, it even is worse from branch to branch, because they're really not cooperating or sharing much of anything with other branches. And I think the best example was during Desert Storm, when General Norman Schwarzkopf was having a daily briefing, and as representing the Army, and he complained that they didn't know if they could march into Baghdad because the Air Force had declared air supremacy within the first night, and then the Navy was still launching the Tomahawks into Iraq, and neither one was on the same page.
And that's a good place to break in here, because we're going to have to take a commercial break. I always want to thank people for taking a look at the best of Project Blue Book, and of course Roswell in the 21st Century and Encounters in the Desert. Take a look at those at Amazon. Make a rating if you can. It certainly will help. You are listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network, and we'll be back right after this, so please stick around. I am joined here with Don Schmitt. Although we are practicing social distancing, being I'm in my house and he's in his, we no longer have to do that because we're fully vaccinated. And the CDC,
we are practically next door, though, Wisconsin, Iowa.
And the CDC says we don't have to wear masks when we go outside anymore, like any of us really listen to that nonsense, but that's a whole nother argument.
Another show.
When we went away, you were, I think, making a good point, and that was something that came up during my tenure in the Gulf as well, that the communication systems didn't communicate well enough, meaning the Army couldn't really communicate with the Air Force, who couldn't communicate with the Navy, who had trouble communicating with the Marines, and they were trying to come up with a system that would allow all the various branches to communicate in a combat environment with one another. And that is kind of, I think, where we are on the UFO thing. If the Navy has something going on, they may not be talking to the Air Force about it, although it seems if they're talking in the continental United States, it's an Air Force problem. If they're out in international waters, I guess it would be a Navy problem. What do you think about the latest Navy things going on, the latest videos, and the Navy kind of involving itself in UFO investigation?
Well, I in many respects, I see it as a repeat of what we experienced when we worked with the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, and that he finally resorted to assigning Congress's own investigative body at that time, when it was called the General Accounting Office, the GAO. And they were not interested in speaking to any witnesses, as we both recall, but they did a request for documents through all the different branches and, again, departments of intel. And they essentially came up empty-handed. They came up with a single FBI document that we already had in our possession.
Well, to make it even worse, the FBI document we had in our possession was not redacted. And the
Right.
one they came up with was redacted.
Was redacted, exactly. And so I'm very concerned that, again, because of this lack of cooperation and the fact that I don't believe there's a member of Congress that is going to know the truth regarding this subject if it hits them between the eyes, for having really zero knowledge of the subject. And whatever they're presented, they're just going to readily accept. And I think their utmost concern, first of all, this involves national security. We're dealing with technology earthbound from one of our adversaries, and that, my God, we're going to have to really catch up because we're falling behind in this particular category, that type of thing. Juxtaposed to, well, we have a major breakdown in intelligence. How come we don't have enough field agents any longer that are bringing us this security information that we can, plan and strategize accordingly, that type of thing. So it comes down to, who would have ever predicted that you'd have the likes of a Stephen Greer right now predicting that this was going to be a false flag, that they're going to essentially announce that we're being invaded. And as a result, we have to, pick up as far as our defense budget, and it might be a diversion or a distraction for something else, more nefarious, that type of thing. And then you have the likes of Dr. Jacques Vallée, considered probably the foremost scientist involved in the field. And he's chasing after a phony crash retrieval in San Antonio, New Mexico at the moment.
Well, interesting you bring that up, because I've been queried about that as well in the last week or 10 days about it. And I looked back into my files. I had a long document of an interview with one of the young men,
Ray Baca. Ray Baca, yeah.
Yeah, and some other documentation I was able to, so I put something up at my blog, which allows me to now say you can read it at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. But it is a very problematic case.
Yes.
Give us a little bit of the details of it, so the listeners know where we are, and those who would like more information, of course, can find it at my blog.
Well, I think my first awareness of this supposed case happened now 25, 26 years ago. I had just lectured in Ventura, California, just north of LA. And I was introduced to this gentleman And the reason the name stood out was because of the Baca, as far as in connection with Barney Barnett.
Yeah, that was my first thought too when I saw the name. I thought of the Baca who lived across the street from Barney Barnett
in Socorro, New Mexico.
Right.
And if it had a connection. And the point is, then, as he was describing to me what they had experienced, and he didn't mention his brother at the time. He spoke as though it was a lone experience on his part.
Well, actually, the other guy was his friend, not his brother.
Yeah, and yet it's being billed as his brother. And then he's describing that this happened out on the plains of San Augustine. And so right there, he started to lose me because, we were still looking into the plains and you and I had spent time out there. In fact, I have a picture of the two of us in front of the huge array, the large array.
The very large array.
Very large array. And Tom Carey and I, we spent a lot of times whenever we had another rancher out in that area between Socorro, Magdalena, Dado, Horse Springs, we were making a side trip over to that region and at least allowing the individual to provide us with whatever information that we might be able to tie to a possible event out in that region. And we came up empty-handed. We were still all on the same page that nothing happened out there as far as 1947 in connection with Roswell. And
well, the interesting thing was that the San Antonio crash allegedly took place in August of 1945, so it's nearly 2 years prior to Roswell.
And Kevin, when Baca first is telling me about this, he's saying that it happened out on the plains in 1947. So it was like every time, and to me, it was almost like a Lieutenant Colonel Willingham situation all over again. That every time we talked to him, the date and the location was changing. And that only goes so far. That only goes, the first time you start changing things, goodbye. And then when he sent us pictures of this artifact, which was clearly a flange from some type of a generator or a motor or something of that sort. And then after they talked to Phyllis Butzing in Butwick, or whatever her name is, in Ohio, to do some analysis on it, and concluded that it was 100% terrestrial. Again, end of story. End of story. So
MUFON did look into it and analyze the metal, and said that it was basically terrestrial, which didn't rule out a extraterrestrial source for it. It means you couldn't prove that it was not terrestrially based metal. But I think what's important here, we need to say that these two youngsters, they were 7 and 9 at the time, had heard something, seen a flash of light, went to the source, saw a downcraft, saw alien creatures that they described to us. Described to others, I guess I should say.
Described them as being frantic, that they were darting and running all over the area, panic-stricken from the crash, that type of thing. And those are all details that we were never told before.
Well, as I say, I outlined this in a posting at my blog about San Antonio, and in fact, there's a link to the photographs that you were the photographs of the material you were talking about as well. Right. There, so people can see exactly what this material looked like. What struck me about this whole thing is they got there allegedly just after the thing crashed. Okay, that's okay. Kids would naturally gravitate toward that to see what's going on. Okay, I buy that. They came back 2 days later, and the beings were gone, but the craft was still there. Eventually, it came about that they were looking at, they were there and they would see military personnel involved in it, cleaning it up, but they didn't do a very good job. They didn't clean it up very well. They didn't secure the site like you would expect so that the kids could get back in, and they actually went and aboard the craft to look around and that sort of thing. And all of that bothers me about the San Antonio crash. And as I say, I kind of lay this whole thing out on the blog. I'm hoping to speak with Jacques Vallée and Paola Harris in June after their book comes out about it as well, because there may be something in there that would clarify the situation and make it seem a little bit more accurate, I suppose. The other thing that always worries me about this is if there was a crash prior to Roswell, probably to 1947, the military doesn't react properly in 1947. If they had already had a crash and they knew what was going on, meaning it's obviously nothing Earth-based, then I suspect that the reaction would have been somewhat different in Roswell, because the people at the top would have known what was going on and stopped some of the nonsense that happened afterwards.
That has always been, our argument as far as anything prior to Roswell, that it's one thing for Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, to have dispatched two of his ranking, his head of intelligence and his head of counterintelligence, as opposed to a couple of enlisted men just to go out and humor the rancher and, just check it out, that type of thing. So, yeah, they treated it, as far as with some semblance of urgency in that regard. But nonetheless, they were still nonchalant about it. They didn't, Blanchard didn't dispatch an immediate, unit to go and cordon off the area. And it's, oh my God, it's happened all over again. And the point being, this is just a few hours away from San Antonio, New Mexico. So certainly there would have been some knowledge to that effect if something should have happened back in 1945.
Well, we're also stuck with the testimony of two guys who were 9 and 7 years old at the time. There's another fellow named Brophy, I think, something like that, whose father was stationed supposedly at Alamogordo in 1945, and they were somehow involved in a retrieval operation. But I've been unable to verify any of that sort of information. The press release that came out about this suggested they had found another witness, a new witness, but I don't know who would have been. And Bach, I think, died in 2009, 2007, 2009. He died a number of years ago.
Right.
Which eliminates one of the witnesses in that respect.
Well, we know how problematic the Plains of San Augustine has been since day one, because in the case of Barney Barnett, now granted, it was all secondhand. We never had the good fortune of speaking with Barnett, but nonetheless, his background, World War I, and his working as a civil engineer with the state at that time, and his reputation within the community, we never found anything that would smack of any fabrication, any false storytelling, any tall tales, that type of thing. But nonetheless, because we were unable, as much as we tried, to come up with additional witnesses, come up as far as with any information that even placed us on a specific location, that we had to dismiss it.
Well,
and
I think
because Roswell, always set such a high benchmark, because you had the press release, you had names in the paper, and we had the base yearbook, and we just had 1,000 names to start with of potential witnesses.
Well, I think we need to examine Barney Barnett a little carefully here, which we'll have to do in just a moment because we're running out of time on this segment. We'll come back to the Plains of San Augustine because there's some things that need to be discussed about the Plains of San Augustine that gets overlooked. And that's one of the problems I have with the UFO community. And what I was talking about with the History magazine was the superficial nature of the research being conducted when we have the tools to go into deep background on this. By sitting in your home, you can access everything.
Yes.
We'll come back to that when we have a chance. I wanted to mention there's some other fine programs about the paranormal as opposed to UFOs on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. So take a look at the website and you'll find something I'm sure that'll be of interest to you. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. Joined by Don Schmitt, we're engaging somewhat into a stream of consciousness investigation of UFOs here because we kind of meander around things and link one thing to the next thing to the next thing. So it's one of these streams of consciousness things, which is not necessarily a bad way of doing this. When we went away, we were talking about the plains of San Augustine, and it's odd that that came up not long ago as well. Somebody was talking about the plains of San Augustine and how it related to UFOs. And what got me was Hurt. It was Wesley Hurt and
Yes, yeah.
and the other guy's name is escaping me at the moment.
Who had
Herbert Dick. Herbert Dick,
right.
And I always wrote the names down in the paragraphs where they came up. It was always be Hurt Dick because I thought that was a proper way of doing it.
I know.
but it came up that Herbert Dick had lied about his involvement on the plains of San Augustine. Just flat out lied, denied he'd even been there. I'm the guy who
working at the Batcave at that time, correct?
Pardon me?
He claimed he was working at the Batcave at that time.
No, he was working at the Batcave, but the one of the things that came up was how he had not he categorically denied he was on the plains in July of 1947. And I'm the guy that talked to him. And what he had told me was he didn't know exactly when he got there, but he didn't think he was there in the first week. And later we found documentation
that he was.
That put him there on July 1st, which means he would have been in a position to see the recovery operation no matter when it took place, because he was there from July 1st through the whole first week through July.
Right.
But that came up again, and we keep fighting these same battles over and over again. I have the documentation that he was there. He didn't see anything. If Barney Barnett was involved in a UFO retrieval, it was not in July of 1947.
In fact, we both interviewed his boss, Fleck Danley, on separate occasions. And the last time I spoke to Danley myself, and I asked him point blank, now, when do you recall that Barney actually, acknowledged this, admitted this, described this to you? What year do you believe this happened? And the best he could come up with, at least for me, was, well, I think it was around 1950 is what he said. And then when Art Campbell, who, probably spent more time investigating the whole Plains of San Augustine event of any sort, and rest in peace, Art. I mean, as far as you were a good friend, though I didn't accept your final conclusions, but nonetheless, when I asked Art, what year do you believe this all happened? And he said, well, we focus on 1947, but we can't confirm that. So even he was being very flexible as to the date in question. Now, as we both know, Kevin, I mean, where were all the rocket launches, the captured German V-2 rocket launches taking place at that time? Well, just to the south, down in White Sands. And when we learned that whenever there was a scheduled launch, they would go out and they would evacuate the ranchers through that region, put them up in a motel in Socorro for the night, never tell them what was going on, what the problem was. And it became part of the background noise, part of this secrecy, level. It became part of the rumor, almost like the folklore of the area. And then there was a radar tracking facility also in the west of Socorro at that time. You could go out there and there are mounds of crushed asphalt after they evacuated and demolished the site many years ago. And so you had military driving in and out within that region occasionally. So that all would lend itself to the notion that something had happened, something had come down, and it became part of the urban legend.
Well, we should point out that Barney Barnett claimed that he had seen the crash saucer on the plains of but he didn't really say the plains of San Augustine. He always said the flats.
Right.
And Gene Maltese, in one of the interviews, wasn't sure where he meant by the flats because there was a number of locations in New Mexico that people referred to as the flats. So it may not have been on the plains of San Augustine.
We learned, and you remember, we both were told that there were areas as far as on the J.B. Foster Ranch that Mac Brazo supervised, that there were areas that were also called the flats. That's very common in, you know.
But the point is, Barnett claimed to have seen the crash saucer and was chased away by the military and that sort of thing. When I talked to Fleck Danley, it was clear to me he didn't have any clue as to when the conversation took place.
Right.
And I thought, and if I pushed him on a number of issues, I could have got him to admit practically anything I wanted to. And of course, in an investigation, you're not wanting to push somebody to get what you want to hear. You're trying to learn what exactly they knew. I think, Carl Flock and I did an article about Barney Barnett.
I recall, yes.
And we published in the IUR, and our conclusion was that if Barnett saw anything, it was probably in 1950. And if he was making up the story, it was because of the release of Behind the Flying Saucers, which was the book Frank Scully had done about a crash, actually 3 crashes of flying saucers, one of them in Aztec, New Mexico. And that information was published in the January 17th issue, I think, of Time magazine. I think it was the January 17th issue. That week in Time magazine about the book with no real commentary about the authenticity of it. So I think that if Barney Barnett was spinning a tale, that was the genesis of it.
Yes, and as we both remember that Bill Moore and Stan Friedman, in trying to come up with bodies to the Roswell event, when the book Roswell Incident came out in 1980, that they elevated the planes to the point that there was a connection. As far as there being any type of connection, I hold them, entirely responsible for that.
Well, I think the point is, and you kind of alluded to it, was when they were doing their book, they had good information about what happened in the Roswell end of things, because they had Bill Brazel, they had Jesse Marcel, but they're all talking about metallic debris. They're not talking about anything really exotic that you can point to and say, this truly is extraterrestrial. When they got to the Barney Barnett story, which came through Vern and Gene Malthays, now they got bodies. Now they've got to connect the two events, and one's over in western New Mexico, one's in southeastern New Mexico. How do we connect these two events so that we can bring the bodies and the extraterrestrial nature in there? And I think that was the reason they worked so hard to connect those two locations, because that did what they needed to do. Now, Bill Moore has come out, I think, since then and kind of repudiated the whole Plains of San Augustine discussion.
I believe you're correct. Yes.
And so, that kind of hurts the Barney Barnett tale. But, and that's the other thing. We've got UFOs raining out of the sky in New Mexico. We have Roswell. We have the Plains of San Augustine. We have Aztec. We have San Antonio.
Yeah, exactly. And as you know, again, as far as within the military, that very often that becomes part of the damage control, part of the containment, in that the boy crying wolf, that you'll flood the area with a lot of essentially BS to obfuscate, the true nature of the actual event. And that was exactly the case in New Mexico at that time, and for a number of years thereafter. And it's discussed earlier, as far as with the both Mogul and the Rowan target balloon devices, where they were putting on the demonstrations all over the country.
I've always been of the impression that the Aztec case was an outgrowth of Roswell, meaning that Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer, who are the two main villains in the tale.
Perpetrators, right, yeah.
Perpetrators, that was a good word. Told Scully about it. I've always been in the impression that somehow, well, they had heard about the Roswell case. It was in the newspapers all around the country, so that they might have blundered into it that way, and thought of this as a way of perpetrating one of their cons. But they moved the event from the Roswell area up to Aztec so that we didn't get associated with the balloon explanation. But I always thought that was kind of the rationale behind their story, and they just left it in New Mexico and ran with it from there.
It certainly is the most likely impetus, as far as that they had so much information already, announced in the press, and just to relocate the event and create a new storyline around it. It really didn't take much effort at that time. And so I agree with you that it was the most simple explanation of what transpired regarding Aztec, that they just shipped Roswell to.
I know a number of people, Frank Warren, for example, disagrees with us on this, and they think that there was some quality information buried in the Aztec case. And turns out that Newton was a very interesting character when you look into his background. I guess he was a championship golfer. For example, played in a number of major tournaments. He hobnobbed with some of the rich and famous because of that sort of thing. And yet it seemed that his personality was such that if there were two ways of doing something, an easy way of doing it or a con, he went for the con every time.
Right. So.
But he was caught up in a number of fraudulent cases and was convicted of a number of fraud. And I think when he died, there were 17 lawsuits against him, and he died virtually penniless, although he lived at the higher end of the spectrum through his manipulation of people and his cons.
And sadly, he took a lot of people with him as a result, because they didn't get paid back for much of his malfeasance.
And the other thing we should say is this is the reason that ufology rejected the ideas of UFO crashes for years and years and years, is because it always came back to Aztec and that great hoax that Frank Scully wrote Behind the Flying Saucers, which was a bestseller of the time, which documented 3 different UFO crashes, Aztec being one of them.
And you're absolutely correct, Kevin. When you think about it, I know Dr. Dave Jacobs would even debate and argue with us that, well, something of this magnitude you couldn't keep secret for all that time. Well, but a lot of it was due to the damage control. And then the guilt by association, as you mentioned, as far as with Frank Scully, that there was that 30-year lull, that if not for Jess Marcel breaking, his oath of silence, that who knows how much longer it would have been before Roswell would have been resurrected. And then,
I would give the credit actually to Len Stringfield.
Yes,
because he started collecting tales of what he termed crash retrievals, and by doing that legitimized a great deal of the research being done. And then, of course, Jess Marcel shows up on the scene, and now we've got a location and a time frame, and we can look back in the newspapers and the limited documentation and say, here is something important that happened. What can we learn about it? And a lot of the people who were involved in that were still alive, and we had an opportunity to speak with them on a first-hand basis rather than dealing with second and third-hand sources that we have to deal with now.
Agreed. And to me, one of the greatest tragedies as far as within the history of UFOs is that Len's original files, not the files, the earlier files before Jess Marcel, and others of any noteworthiness, that MUFON, touts and they claim that they have, the Len Stringfield files. No, they have the first set prior to his MUFON conference presentation in 1977 in Dayton, where the floodgates just opened. Those files are still withheld by the family based on Len's final wishes. And wouldn't we love to have had access? And as we both know, Len had promised us we were going to get those. And again, third-party interference, and it shot it all down. But to have all those names and to be able to, look into some of the more contemporary, where there's still witnesses hopefully alive.
Well, we're going to have to take a break here. Once again, now we're involved in crash retrievals. And we'll return to that topic when we come back after this, because I think it's where important information lies, and not only of it about crash retrievals, but how some of the hoaxing has gone on, and some of the divides in ufology are also there. I've always got a lot of extra information about our discussions at the blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And when we come back, Don, I'm going to get you to tell me where they can find more information about your research and what you've been doing as well. You're listening to A Different Perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. We'll be back right after this. am here with Don Schmitt. We've been talking a lot of information about various aspects of ufology here in the last 45 minutes. When we broke away, we were getting into crash retrievals and the work that Len Stringfield had done. And I'll note here that prior to Len's research into this and Len's publication of his various monographs on crash retrievals, 4 or 5 of them that came out over the years before his death, most of us in ufology rejected the idea of flying saucer crashes. We just didn't believe they were anything to look into. And I will say today, I think there's lists of 300 or 400 different crashes around the world, and I don't think that's feasible. It's just impossible. I would limit it to a handful and maybe a fingerful to kind of go in that direction, that there's just not that many UFO crashes going around. But it was Len Stringfield's work that got us interested in this sort of thing. And his idea was that he would collect the stories and he would do some research into them, but he would also publish other stories he didn't have an opportunity to research into, thinking that somebody else would pick up the mantle and run with it. Maybe clarifying the situation, showing why it's a hoax, showing what it really was, how something had been misinterpreted. And I think that was a real service that Len Stringfield had done to the UFO community.
Absolutely. And I'm proud of the fact that, and you and I made numerous visits with Len, and we stayed in regular communication with him. And then we had that final meeting with him at the QFOS office in Chicago. And that's where he had provided us with his final decision about turning his files over to us and respectfully QFOS upon his death. And that we had, gained his confidence enough that we had done something that even J. Allen Hynek wasn't able to do, and that was gaining the cooperation of Len, and specifically in providing the names and the contact information of these so-called whistleblowers. And it's, again, just very unfortunate. That,
I think the one thing I noticed about our discussions with Len is he didn't want to violate the confidences on with some of the people.
He was tremendous on that. I mean, nobody could. I mean, I think that's another reason he became such a magnet, because he demonstrated that he could be trusted with their confidential information.
But I also noticed that when you and I were sitting with him talking about these things, and he was looking at his files, that once in a while he would reveal something on the paper, not saying it to us, but reveal it on the paper to give us a clue on how to find some of the people. And I think he kind of did that as a way of alerting us to where you needed to go to research, to how you needed to contact these people that would lead us into other arenas. And in
that way, he could say, I didn't provide any information. I didn't violate that trust. If they happen to see something, well, I can't help that.
And we can say, well, Len didn't tell us anything.
Precisely.
And we can say that with all honesty. So I think that was a good thing. But I was impressed with, he was the one that got the Willingham story, published something about the Willingham story. The guy who claimed as a fighter pilot he'd seen a UFO crash on the Texas-Mexico border near Del Rio, Texas, back in originally in 1948, I think it was.
Yeah, 48, 50, 51, 52.
I noticed that in my research, I asked a number of people, did you vet this guy, Willingham? And they said, well, no, somebody else did. And nobody ever did it. So I went back and got his military record and discovered he'd been in the Army for 13 months, was not a fighter pilot, was not an officer. And he kept changing the dates. I actually found the original story that appeared in Skyhook, which was a forerunner to the MUFON Journal, where Willingham talked about this event and putting it in 1948 and that sort of thing. But then it became 1950. And then the last time I talked to Willingham, it was in the mid-1950s, 54, 55, somewhere in there.
Well, he had even conned Hynek. And I think where he had fooled Hynek was with his so-called sworn affidavit, and that he had given a statement. And it was one of the reasons that Hynek himself became more intrigued by crash retrieval cases. But again, unfortunately, it was by the likes of Lieutenant Colonel Willingham.
Well, we've kind of hinted around, I'm fumbling for the question here, kind of hinted around various crash retrievals. Which ones do you think are authentic? Of all the crash retrievals that have been talked about, and I did a book called Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, and I think there's 110 cases listed in that book. Which ones do you think are authentic? Obviously Roswell, but from there, where do we go?
Well, and Roswell, I guess, mainly for the fact that they started it. They're the ones that put out that press release. We didn't. It's not like we came in, and you and I both were skeptical on Roswell. We both thought we'd make that weekend jaunt down to New Mexico and, have a good time and wrap this up, in due course, that type of thing. And the rest is history. But I like Las Vegas, and I know that's a case that you looked into, and the fact that it had multiple sightings prior to the explosion over Las Vegas. Now, not that that was an actual crash of an object, but that at least there's a bit of a paper trail.
Well, I talked to a lot of people involved in this, and I'm now convinced that the Air Force was right when they split the two events, the one in Utah and the one in Las Vegas, apart. I think there was, but that's another long involved story about that. There was no object retrieved or anything like that, but there were a number of cases where we had electromagnetic effects going on and the object making a great swooping turn and proving that it wasn't a meteor. I'm not convinced that was a crash retrieval, but there's some interesting aspects to that case. But where else would you go?
I'm very curious about what or who the sources were for Dorothy Kilgallen as far as on Spitsbergen. And the fact that just as much as she was becoming intrigued with that possibility, and then she was getting involved with the JFK assassination and everything, and then she has that untimely death. Not that there was necessarily any connection, but I think she is, as a true journalist for her time, highly respected, highly regarded, and that if it was enough to attract her interest, based on whatever or whoever her sources were, that there potentially was some pay dirt to it. I don't go along with Aztec or Farmington or Kecksburg, any of those sort, even Brazil.
Wait, stop.
Yes.
Kecksburg? You're saying Kecksburg is not a UFO crash?
I still remain unconvinced because of the bolide, because of the reentry possibility at the time, and the description, the shape of the craft, and the markings on it. I'm still open to Soviet reentry.
Interesting, because I've come to the similar conclusions, although I'm not sure the Soviet reentry figures into it, but that may be a factor. But I've often thought that there was an awful lot of false information. You remember we interviewed a number of people who went there early in the morning, archaeology students, and I remember sitting in their living room talking about, and they arrived in Kecksburg at like 4 or 5 in the morning, and everything was dead. Nobody was around. Nothing was going on.
Right.
And if you think it was this big retrieval operation, there would have been people around. And that always kind of intrigued me. And of course, as you mentioned, the bolide, clearly there was a meteor fall that day that would explain it. And if you've got a smoke trail from the meteor, which is not unusual, the winds aloft would blow it around. So you get the impression that the thing made turns when it did not. So it's interesting that you brought up Kecksburg as being not.
Well, and we both know that, especially if it was any reentry, if it was an American reentry, that NASA and the all the documentation that it supposedly was taken directly to Wright Pat in Dayton, Ohio, that would have been the case if it would have been ours, if it would have been Soviet or alien. In any event, they would have been involved.
Well, I was interesting that you kind of on the same page I am on Kecksburg. What about Shag Harbor?
A very, very good case. I think just all the circumstances, the fact that it's submerged, within the bay, that area. I think the eyewitness testimony is held up. And I think some of the independent investigation that a parallel regarding the case that, I find it a case that to me remains wide open.
The interesting thing about that I've thought of, I always thought of it as not really a crash retrieval, but more of an emergency landing.
Mm-hmm,
and the object lands in the water. There's actually a photograph of it, and I published it in the book I did 20-some years ago called The Randle Report, picture of the object in the sky. The Condon Committee had an opportunity to investigate, and I think Jim Lorenzen alerted them to them. They called up there, and I saw just a bunch of teenagers saw something and didn't get into it and ignored the information. Don Ledger and Chris Stiles have done a wonderful job of researching that case.
Absolutely. And as we know, I mean, there have been many cases of underwater, as far as UFOs witnessed and documented, and even foreign navies, that type of thing. So I think you may be onto something, the idea that it was an emergency landing, or it just decided it was going to, submerge as far as the harbor there. And who knows where it went from there.
There was a great response. There was a lot of people. There were law enforcement involved in it, not just teenagers. There was a lot of documentation that Chris Stiles and Don Ledger recovered from the Canadian government about the case. And I guess the U.S. Navy was involved. There may have been some Soviet presence as well at the time.
Well, as we know, they did an underwater as far as investigation. They went down. They went and looked as far as to see if there was anything. And that's the amazing thing. The point being that something did impact, it did crash and submerge as far as into the water. And the point being, then where did it go?
Yes, exactly. Anything else that sticks out in your mind as a good crash retrieval, though?
I know I often present the argument that if I accept Roswell, then it makes everything else possible. But everything else, pales in comparison, and mainly because of, that benchmark press release and the fact that the newspapers covered it as heavily as they did for the time. There's nothing else like that. And it immediately involved, the elite, the most, the 509 bomb group, the people in charge of the atomic bomb, that it was ready-made. It was as though if you were going to concoct a whole crash, UFO scenario, that it was much beyond the thing from outer space, up in the Arctic Circle type of thing.
Well, Don, I think we're out of time here, and I wanted to talk to you about abductions, and we're not going to get to it. You'll have to come back and talk to me about abductions at some time in the future, I think.
Well, we look forward to it, as always.
Where can people find out more stuff about your research and what you've been doing?
Well, we have the website, which is roswellinvestigator.com. And certainly all the books are available at Barnes & Noble. And Barnes & Noble is still in existence, aren't they?
I was going to say Barnes & Noble, they still exist.
Is about it, yeah. And Amazon, certainly.
Okay. Next week, I'm going to be talking to a guy named Rob Brun-Del-Rey, who wrote a book called UFOs Proof Positive. Proof Positive.
Easy for you to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll have some interesting discussion with him about the evidence he presents in the book and how much of the proof is positive. My books, of course, like Don's, are available at Amazon.com. The latest is UFOs in the Deep State, which looks at the way this situation is developed and answers the questions of why does the government still deny this thing? Why are they still saying it hasn't happened? Why are they pretending that UFOs aren't real, aren't alien spacecraft? And it looks at that in depth, I think, and gives an idea, answers that question. Also take a look at Roswell in the 21st Century, Encounters in the Desert, and of course the best of Project Blue Book. I will be back in 167 hours with more information on UFOs. So thanks for tuning in.